All right, continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab, today we are pleased to welcome back Jackie Graziano. After spending several years in publishing and advertising, she changed her career path and went into library and archival work, receiving her MLS from Queens College with a certificate in archives and records management. She was fortunate to land the job of archivist with Westchester County in 2007. The archives is a resource for all county departments as well as the general public. She handles all research questions, oversees the archives reading room, and is in charge of preservation for the archives collections, which includes digitizing records. Today's presentation will be called Placing People in Westchester, highlighting lesser known records in the collections of the Westchester County Archives that are useful for finding out where your Westchester ancestors were located. She'll be digging deeper into the collection than we did in her previous presentation with an overview by century, 17th through the 20th century. And she will also highlight some resources held by the Westchester County Historical Society, which is located in the same building with the archives. The archives is the repository for Westchester County's historic government documents from the late 17th through the mid 20th centuries. And the Westchester County Historical Society holds the county's largest library of local history resources. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Jackie.
Thank you, Suzanne. I want to thank you specifically, and also Truckee Meadows Community College for hosting me today. It's a privilege to speak with you all. It's just really exciting. I'm glad for the opportunity to be here. As she mentioned, my name is Jackie Graziano. I'm the archivist with Westchester County Archives. And we are the repository for Westchester County's historic government records. The collection dates back to 1684. We share the building with the Westchester County Historical Society and haven't really had a chance to highlight them much. So I'm going to take that opportunity today because both collections really complement each other well. And I think some of the resources in their collection deserve some notice as well. Let me see, get on to the next one. So a quick overview of what I'm talking about today. Do my introduction, talk a little bit about New York and Westchester records. I'll do then the review of resources in the Westchester County Archives, our collection, and the Westchester County Historical Society. Then I'm going to do a couple of quick demonstrations, including the Deeds Index, which is on the Westchester County Clerk's Office website, and then our website, show you how to find our indexes and our guide to collections, show you a little bit about our digital website. I always talk a little bit about the importance of documenting your sources when you're doing research. I will actually allow, if you have a question, pressing question throughout, you can certainly jump in and ask one, but I'll pause occasionally for questions as well along the way. And I always put up a contact sheet, although I've provided a handout with contact information. So about New York and Westchester records, well, for those of you who have experience in doing genealogy, you've probably noticed that New York is a rather challenging state to get records from. It's not you, it's us. New York is just a challenging state. There's no central repository. Some states do have central repositories for records. New York, unfortunately, does not. Couple of reasons why New York is so challenging. One is that, it's old. New York is one of the earliest areas that was settled by Europeans. And the first couple of centuries, at least the first century or so, was not the most stable time. The territory was wrangled over by the British and the Dutch. It's not optimal conditions for keeping and saving records. And there were more settled, stable areas in Manhattan and then in Albany where records tended to be kept and preserved better than they were in Westchester. And of course, then we had the Revolutionary War, also not optimal conditions for saving records. So it's not until after the Revolution that we really see good, stable keeping of records locally. But I have provided a resource sheet if you have ancestors who were in the Westchester area early on, 17th century, early 18th century, showing you where else you can look for records that if they're not here in Westchester. The Westchester County Archives, of course, as I mentioned, repository for government records, mostly primary sources because they were created by or given information from people who were directly involved with the event that the record records. And the Westchester County Historical Society has a mix. They have a lot of secondary sources, books on local history, pamphlets, newspapers, periodical articles, but they do have a collection of manuscripts, which would be primary sources, and they also have local family recollections, collections of papers, which would be primary sources as well. The reason the records are good for placing people is because most of them are indexed by name. So you don't need to know where people were to find the records. All you need is a name. If some of the collections are a little challenging, we're always here as a resource. There are historical societies, the librarian Patrick Raftery is a walking encyclopedia of Westchester history. He's a great person to work with, and we're both happy to help in any capacity that we can help as a resource for finding records on your ancestors. A little bit more about New York records, and these specifically are going to impact some of what I'll be talking about, some of the challenges, two specific challenges. Vital records were not officially kept in New York State until 1881 or even later in some areas. As I mentioned, there's no central repository for records in New York State, and there was very little general oversight until that time period. New York tried a couple of times before the 1880s to keep vital records. And when I talk about vital records, I'm talking specifically about birth, death, and marriage records. They tried in the late 1840s, and it didn't really continue on. And it wasn't until the 1880s they passed a state mandate, and the towns and counties really started to comply with it. But it was left up to the counties to do it or not, as they chose. And some towns within Westchester started complying right away, and some didn't really start complying until the late 1880s, 1886, 1887. So you're going to see a little bit of an unevenness there, even once the vital records are available. But what I will be talking about are types of records that can fill in those blanks and that can serve as a substitute for those kinds of records. Also, what causes a lot of confusion is that the Bronx, and actually I meant to mention that Westchester is located in southern New York State. We are just north of New York City, and the territory that is now, well, it's the county now known as the Bronx. It was part of Westchester until the late 1800s. And that causes some confusion because all the records that would have been filed with, say, the county clerk's office or the courts that existed during whatever time period we're talking about would be with the Westchester County Archives with us. But once the territory was annexed by New York City and the city took the western portion, I'll show you in a little bit on a map what I'm talking about. In 1874, 20 years later, they annexed the eastern portion, so that doesn't cause any confusion. But I found out that those records from that in-between time period where records were created and should have been preserved by New York City because they weren't going to Westchester County anymore, the municipal archives in New York City should have those. And I've provided some contact information in that handout that I sent. In 1914, the Bronx was created as its own county, and then from then on, but that's what, 200 plus years after people were settling the area, Europeans were settling the area. So that's a long time period not to have a stable record repository for a region. So here's Westchester County. To the left, of course, is the western portion boundary is the Hudson River. Beyond that is New Jersey and part of New York State. To the north is what's now Putnam County. It was originally Dutchess County, and then Putnam was broken off from Dutchess, and Dutchess is now north of Putnam. To the east, we've got Connecticut, and then Long Island Sound, and as I mentioned, to the south is the Bronx in New York City. Here's a map of Westchester showing the original towns that were created after the Revolutionary War, showing the Bronx. So you know what I'm talking about if I'm talking about the region of the Bronx. The western portion, which is yellow, was formed from southern Yonkers. An area in between that and Morrisania was originally, Morrisania, the southern portion of that area, was originally a manor owned by the Morris family. And then, you know, the property was sold, but the name has been retained because the Morrises were quite prominent. And that middle region, which is not named, was known as West Farms. And that's going to pop up in some records I'm going to highlight later. The eastern portion was carved out from a little bit of Eastchester, which was actually southern portion of Mount Vernon, what's now Mount Vernon, Pelham, the town of Pelham, and Westchester Borough Town. So if any of those names, or if you've come across them, didn't know what they mean, that's where they come from. It's all territory that used to be part of Westchester is now the Bronx. So getting to the review of resources, I just want to mention, first of all, this is not a comprehensive list. Definitely check our websites. I've provided, again, URLs for our website and the Historical Society's regular website and their digital website. And you should really explore them, and I'll show you a little bit about our website later on. I just wanted to mention that the handout I provided of the slides, I did have to leave a few out because they were images I took from published books, and I didn't want to run into any potential copyright issues. So some of those slides, as I'm going through the presentation, you won't see in the handout I provided. So I just wanted to avoid any confusion with that. They were left out on purpose. I will cover by time period because I'm an archivist. So I think of things in terms of historic periods, covering the archives first and then the Historical Society. And there's going to be some repetition in what I talk about with the Historical Society, just because a lot of what they have covers a long time period. So some of these sources I mentioned in them are just, they're going to keep popping up throughout. Whereas with the archives, there's like distinctive periods that certain records cover. So starting with the 17th century, what's available through the archives, these are some pretty obvious primary sources. This is what was available and created and being collected at the time period of the late 17th century. The courts, they started establishing some courts. The Court of Sessions was a court that handled civil and criminal cases. It did have a local function here. It was created in 1684. We have minute books, which means that they are details of actual cases that took place. These have not been indexed and they're not digitized, but we're just happy to have the books at this point. The deeds, of course, help place people. The first deeds were recorded in 1684. They go all the way up to the present, of course. These are indexed. They've all been digitized. Some have been transcribed. Just a few caveats on this. If the deed was not registered with the county clerk's office, we will not have a copy of it. These are only documents that were brought to the county clerk's office for the clerk to make a copy of it and keep on file at the county level. However, some deeds were recorded at the state level, so they are available through the New York State Archives. And some towns were doing their own registering of deeds, most notably Rye and Mamaroneck, which are in the south of Westchester, the southern portion of Westchester. There's also in the Historical Society's manuscript collection a number of unrecorded deeds. These are, the manuscripts have all been indexed by name, so they are available for you to find by family name. And it's definitely worth exploring that. If you have been exploring or will try to explore the deeds index in the future and you're not finding something, contact us or contact the Archives or Historical Society, If the family has been here early enough and long enough, there's a good chance that some of those records might show up in their manuscript collection. The mortgages, we have an index that starts in 1684. Unfortunately, the first about 70 years of records have disappeared. They were not preserved. We don't have them, but we do have the index. So at least we have an indication that some sort of record did exist at some point, and the names are recorded, at least the mortgager is recorded. So we know that something existed, some action did take place. So I like to highlight a few of our records here and there, do a little show and tell. This is Westchester County's oldest surviving public record. It is the will of Philip Galpin, and it shows where he was from. He was from Rye. Library A is our oldest book of records. It covers 1684 to 1688. It's called a deed book because it primarily contains deeds, but there are obviously, since it was the original book of records, it contains other types of records as well. There are a few wills and there's a few marriages in it as well. As you can see, it is written in English, but the handwriting is a little challenging to read. But we are happy to have it as it is. Here's a page from the Court of Sessions minutes that I mentioned before. This, as you can see, was transcribed. This is for William Gray, an order for his estate to be administered, which meant that he had passed away without a will. This was a court function later taken over by the Surrogates Court, which was established in Westchester after the Revolutionary War. But for this time period, you know, the Court of Sessions sometimes handled these events. And this is for William Gray, was a resident of Westchester Town, which, as I mentioned, is a region that is now in the Bronx. So from the Historical Society, you're going to see these are mostly secondary sources, books and other compilations that are not primary, you know, created by people who had a firsthand account of an event. But manuscripts, of course, are primary sources, and the earliest one dates from even earlier than ours, 1661. Mackenzie's family of the colonial town of Phillipsburg is a really significant source because Phillipsburg was one of the manors that was formed in Westchester by one of the wealthy families that took a lot of territory. They had tenant farmers living on their property, renting land and running the farms. And Phillipsburg is the best documented of these because it was the longest lasting manor. It lasted up through the Revolutionary War. The reason it was abolished during the Revolutionary War was because the Phillips family were loyalists. And so their land was confiscated after the Revolutionary War. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Grenville Mackenzie reached out to all of the families that had ancestors in that territory, and even some that actually had a presence in Phillipsburg and then moved out of the area. So they're covered in that book as well. There are genealogies that cover several generations from about the year 1600 to about 1800. So it's a really great resource. There are some discrepancies. We're not really sure which edition our bound copy contains, because I've seen manuscript copies floating around. Some of them are contained in genealogy files in the Historical Society's collection that have notes on them that are not in the bound edition. So some of it you have to take with a grain of salt and try to verify through other sources. But as a starting point, it is an excellent resource for all of the families that lived in that region. Abstracts of wills, secondary sources, of course. The wills were filed either in New York City or in Albany because, again, there was no court that handled that function other than, you know, occasionally by the Court of Sessions. There's no surrogates court, which is the name for the probate court in Westchester. No presence for that until after the Revolutionary War. But there are compilations of abstracts of wills, and they are listed by names of people, so they're helpful for placing people because of that. Historical Society Cemetery Index is an excellent source for finding, of course, where people are buried, but also where families live. If you see a whole family buried together in one cemetery. Of course, you know that they probably lived in that town. Cemetery indexes booklets that contain inscriptions from headstones. People went around through a cemetery and collected all the inscriptions, wrote them down, collected them into notebooks. There's about 90 of those notebooks that represent most of the older cemeteries, not every cemetery, but most of the older cemeteries, dating back, of course, before the Revolutionary War. And somebody went through all the booklets and indexed them by name. So we have a name index for all of those entries. The church records usually are transcriptions or copies that they've acquired from the churches. Some of them are indexed, some of them are not, but again, they represent most of the oldest churches in Westchester. And I just want to give a little shout out here that Patrick Raftery, again, the librarian from the Historical Society, has written books about Westchester cemeteries and also the cemeteries in the Bronx, because it was originally part of Westchester. And so he is very knowledgeable about cemeteries and Westchester churches. If you have questions about how to find burial sites or church records, he would definitely be the one to contact. He's very helpful with that. Genealogy journals, they have a complete run of the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society's journal and American Genealogist. Of course, NYGB also has their own research collection, which I believe is located at the New York Public Library's main site on Fifth Avenue in New York City now. But they're also, you know, they have genealogists who work through them, and you can contact them if you have also specific questions that you want looked at in a deep way. Some of the towns were keeping local census records starting from the 1680s, and the Historical Society has copies of those. And there were a couple of towns that were very enterprising, started early on keeping their own records. Most notably, Bedford and Eastchester have town minutes dating back to the 1600s. I think Bedford 1660, Eastchester 1680s. Bedford has an excellent local history collection too, with original manuscripts, and they have a wonderful, wonderful local history historian who's very helpful. So as I was talking about Phillipsburg Manor, here's a map that shows, hand drawn by me, the four largest manors that existed in Westchester, just showing how much land four families controlled at one point in Westchester. And that means that all the farmers that worked for these families, you know, smaller, would have rented land from the family to run their farm. Cortlandt Manor started to break up a little after 1700, just because the Van Cortlandts had a lot of children, and they started leaving portions of the property to their children, who then started, you know, proliferating with their own families and selling off pieces of the property. So Cortlandt Manor was not an intact entity for that long. Scarsdale and Pelham Manors also were sold and started to break up fairly early on to early 1700s. But Phillipsburg Manor continued on through the Revolutionary War as an intact entity. And again, the land was confiscated and sold, and we have records of those land sales. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a little while. But that Phillipsburg Manor, for those of you who may be familiar with the area from your own research, covered the towns of Ossining, Mount Pleasant, Greenburgh, and Yonkers. Again, a little more show and tell. Here's Historical Society's oldest record from 1661. This is John Budd's deed from Sachem Chief Shannock for property in Rye, that's down on Long Island Sound. So I like to show these because I think they're very cool looking. Here's a page from Mackenzie's Families of the Colonial Town of Phillipsburg. Again, covers genealogies, several generations of these family genealogies from about 1600 to about 1800. Useful because he has a little bit of a biographical description for the men, lists all their children. The plus next to the name means there's a further entry for that person later on in a subsequent generation. He tells, you know, birth time, birth year, who they married if known, And so, like I said, it fills in a lot of blanks and is a really good place to start for any of these families that lived in the Phillipsburg area. Here's an abstract of title page from one of the Abstracts of Wills books. Again, listed by last name. This one starts fairly early on, 1626. It covers all of New York, but by name listed, and it gives the town and county residents, so helps you place people that way. Moving into the 18th century, the archives, available at the archives. We have a couple of very interesting collections, and as you can see, some of them cover just not very many years. Some of them continue on for quite a while. The bastardy proceedings are interesting because they mention women, take testimony from women, which was an unusual occurrence in 18th century courts. I'll show you an example of one in a little bit. These are indexed and are mixed in with the court records in the index to court records on our website. The Board of Supervisors meeting minutes. These are abstracts. They didn't contain full minutes. The Board of Supervisors was created around 1702. We don't have the early years of their records. They're currently known as the Board of Legislators. It's the legislative branch of Westchester County government, the one that dealt with the laws and actions. They did not meet during the Revolutionary War. So what they're mostly useful for, but then of course they picked up again after the war. What they're mostly useful for is if you had someone who was a county official or a landowner, it would mention where they were located and what action they were mentioned for. The commissioners of forfeiture, as you can see, didn't take place for very long. It's very significant though. These were the sales of property that were seized from loyalists after the end of the Revolutionary War. Our copy of it is actually abstracts. The actual deeds should be in the deeds index. These are digitized and indexed and available on our digital website, and I will show you that in a little while. Court records, there's proliferation of more courts being established in the early to mid 1700s. So there are more court records available. They don't all tell you where people were located, but enough of them do. And of course, it's a significant collection, so it's worth mentioning. Unfortunately, only portions of these have survived because the courts were not required to keep the full records until about the middle of the 1800s. But what we have, this was a project that was done early on when the archives was first created. We had several volunteers going through these and indexing them, and they indexed every single name, regardless of what role that person played in that court action. So they are all indexed by name, and the names, again, indexes on our website. Mortgages by 1755, we have the full records. So again, placing people by where they were buying property and getting mortgages on it. And the index goes up through, I believe, 1897. We have the record books here on site for storage up through 1910. Religious and corporation records starting in 1784, also indexed. That index is not on our website, but I have it internally and can access it that way. If you have a question about, somebody was prominent in starting a church or a religious organization, they will be mentioned in that record. Again, it will place them because it will tell you which town the organization was formed in. Surrogates, the probate court, established after the Revolutionary War in 1718. Those records are all indexed. It's a very significant collection, and significant also because they were finally being held locally in Westchester. This covers original wills and also the probate files, which in the index are called estate inventories. A little bit of a misnomer because not every single file has an inventory in it. The online index mentions the wills and the people that we have probate files for. A little bit of a caveat on these is that Family Search did some partnering with us and microfilmed the index and also a lot of the surrogates court books, which were copies of wills and some of the probate notes. That is not an entire will or an entire probate file. So if you have found something for someone on Family Search, thinking that you have the full file or will, I would double check with us, make sure that there isn't something more to it, because as I said, they did not make copies of the entire file. So in some cases, we have a full probate file that contains a lot more information that is not in those books. Conversely, the books are not indexed in our online index, so that's something we hope to work on in the future and get those indexed and that index online too. So there are some cases where we don't have a file for someone because the file disappeared, but we do have a copy of a will, and that I have to dig into the old microfilm index to find. The tax receipt book and the road commissioner's book. These are records of activities of landowners, taxes they were paying, responsibilities for upkeeping the roads. They are indexed, and of course they tell where people were located because they were responsible for property and upkeeping roads. The Veteran Cemetery Index was a WPA project. It is not comprehensive. It doesn't list every veteran who enlisted, lived, was born, or died in Westchester. But it is a pretty rich resource as far as if the card was filled out quite thoroughly, you'll get some information about the person's military record, where they were born, where they died, what they died of, and where they're buried. Those have been digitized and they're available on our digital website. And of course, they don't only tell the burial site, but they also tell in many cases where the person was born and where they served. Here's a bastard proceeding for an event that took place in Cortland Manor. It mentions not just the man, the father of the child, but also the mother, Catherine McKnight. An early deed from 1703 from Jacob Van Cortland of Van Cortland Manor, buying a little extra property near the Bedford area from Chief Sachem Katona. Katona is, of course, a place name in Westchester now. There's a village called Katona. And what I like about this one is it shows the signature marks of the various chiefs who were involved in the sale of the property. And here's a will, placing Abraham Odell and his family in Yonkers. So moving into the Historical Society records for 18th century, they have a biography index. It's mostly prominent people in Westchester, but of course, those entries will mention other family members and people associated with the person. Books on family and local history, I would say, aside from just helping place people just because of the information contained in them, the bibliographies are a rich resource for further places to search for records on families, especially if the person was able to acquire access to a collection of family papers or some repository where they were able to get a vein of lots of information on the family. It can point you to that. So always look at bibliographies of local history books. The Borkwin collection is associated with the Phillipsburg Manor. This is a terrific resource. Again, if you have people who were in the Phillipsburg Manor area, if you don't know exactly where they were, there is a map that shows where each family was located, which tenant farmer family, how much land their farm covered, where the boundaries were, who was next to them. And he also did research on who was there before the Revolutionary War as a tenant farmer, how much rent they were paying, how much territory they covered. And then after the Revolutionary War, who bought the property and how much they paid for it and how big it was at that point. Because not everybody who was a tenant farmer purchased the land that they were working. In some cases, they did not. So it's a terrific record with the before and after to know who was there, where they were located. Cemetery index continues, church records continue through the 18th century, and of course they've got the first federal census from 1790, which is indexed for those of you who like to access every single copy of a record, not just the ones that are online. Historical Society does have that that census. Genealogy files I mentioned very often are collections of family papers that people have donated to them or research projects that they've done on a family. But they also very often will include previous correspondence that they've had from family members doing research, what they were looking for and how they answered them. And the McDonald Papers is another very interesting collection from a significant time period. These are eyewitness accounts of events that took place during the Revolutionary War, anything from battle and troop movements to just everyday occurrences that someone just remembered. Oh, I saw, General Rochambeau ride by my house when I was a little boy. I was peeking out from the apple tree. They're indexed by name, so they place people where they were in Westchester. Also significant because a lot of records during the Revolutionary War were not, they were put into safekeeping somewhere and then just didn't survive. So here we have this collection that tells of people's actions and where they are placed during that time period. Here's a page from the Dutch Reformed Church records. Of course, one of the oldest churches in Westchester, located in Sleepy Hollow, famous area. A page of baptisms from 1708. It's by date, but it tells where people were from that Sleepy Hollow area. McDonald Papers, here's a page from this. A recollection from a Mrs. Palmer from Stony Point, which is actually across the river from Westchester, so it's not just Westchester. And then Ezra Lockwood from Westchester Town, which was located in part of the Bronx. And here we have a page from some early marriages. Again, this is all through New York, covering a 30-year period, but it's earlier than we have marriages. And there is one from Westchester from 1768 up at the top there. Going into the 19th century, the archives has, these are all indexed. Not all the indexes are on our website, but again, if you're interested in accessing something that's not indexed on our website, definitely contact me. The Alms House records. Alms House actually was established in around 1830, but again, we don't have records from the early years. They start about 1854. The most comprehensive records are from about 1875 to 1908. And the state, for some reason, has the later record books, and I believe they've partnered with Ancestry and made those available online. But if you're having difficulty accessing them on Ancestry, you can contact the New York State Archives for them. Beginning in 1847, when the court system was reorganized in New York, then we have full court cases, no longer just fragments, for the county court and the Supreme Court, which was a state level court, but it has a presence in each county. Of course, because the early years of those records, there are some gaps in the holdings, but we have them all the way up through 1911 full court cases. And that could be anything from a divorce to, a lawsuit, dispute over property, lots of interesting things in there. And they are indexed, and we have the index books. That index, of course, is not online yet either, but we'll be working on it. Homestead exemptions, interesting records. These are, according to state law, properties that were exempt from being seized and sold for debts. Those records start about 1850. Those are indexed by name, again, so they will tell you where people were located because they have to do with property. Incorporation records for local businesses or organizations start about 1848, indexed by business name and by name. That index is not on our website either, but again, so contact me. But again, they tell you where the business was located or where the people were located associated with that business. And then maps and atlases, our holdings for that start in the 1830s, not just for placing people, maps that show property ownership, but they also Some of them cover public works projects and show who lived in a certain area where, say, the Croton Aqueduct land was taken for that, which is part of the New York City water system, and whose land that ran through. One of the notable ones for that being Alexander Hamilton's son, James. He was living in Irvington. Miscellaneous records could be anything, deeds, appointments of offices. That index is on our website, and those start about 1840. Naturalization records, our holdings start about 1808. Don't really have a lot of them until about the 1840s, and unfortunately, those don't contain much personal information until about the 1890s, when they start mentioning where people were living. Some of them do mention earlier where people were located, but it's just a significant collection, so I have to mention it. School reports starting 1828. There's some gaps in those, and those are lesser helpful at actually placing people, but I will show you what they are useful for because I have a sample one I'm going to show you in a little bit. So here's a homestead exemption for land in West Farms, again, section of the Bronx. Here's an almshouse intake record from 1872. It shows the town the woman was admitted from. Her family was living in Eastchester when she was sent to the almshouse in 1872. And she lived in the almshouse until she passed away in 1882. So what makes this also significant is that she would not have been listed in the 1880 census with her family in Eastchester. She would have been missing, most likely. Where she would have been listed was as an inmate of the almshouse, and the almshouse was located in the town of Mount Pleasant. So here's a page of school reports for a school district in Mamaroneck, showing the names of all the heads of the household or the guardians of the children, how many children were in the school district, and whether they were from the town of Mamaroneck or the village of Larchmont, which was located in Mamaroneck. What's significant about this one particularly, and why I chose it, is because of the date 1893. Those of you who've done genealogy for a while know that the 1890 federal census was destroyed, a good portion of it. So a lot of it doesn't exist anymore. And this can serve as a sort of a fill-in for the census by placing these people in Mamaroneck. Sources, 19th century for Historical Society. There are newspaper collections start in the 1830s. Some newspapers they have significant holdings from, and one particularly the Eastern State Journal, which was a White Plains newspaper, so it covers all of Westchester. That newspaper was indexed for marriage and death notices. Those listings are alphabetical by name, so again, they will place people where they were living when they married or when at the time of their death. Directories starting 1860 for businesses and for people. Federal censuses, of course, they have all the way through the century and have been indexed up through 1850. Again, if you're a diehard who has to see every copy of something, they have it on microfilm. Again, local histories, periodicals, important for the bibliographies and where else they can point you, as well as placing people through the information contained in them. And they have a lot more maps showing property ownership from the 19th century. Earlier maps in their collection tend to not be originals, they're photostats. They still can be useful for placing people, but they don't show a lot of detail either. By the 19th century, you know, map making got better and there's more detail on those maps. So here's an 1860 business directory by business type, who owned the business and where they were located. Here's a page from Lives Well Spent, which is the name of the index of death notices from the Eastern State Journal. This was the previous librarian for the Historical Society who did all this amazing indexing. The Eastern State Journal was published from 1845 up through 1917. I believe the index, the they managed to complete, the first book covers 1845 up to 1875. As you can see, it's alphabetical by last name, and that is the entire notice that was in the newspaper. So whatever's here is what exists. You don't have to then follow up and go dig it up out of the newspaper. This is the entire record. There's another book that she compiled that covers from 1876 up to, I think, 1896. And I hope they're still working on more indexing. I'd like to see that completed. But the paper has been digitized now, so that's also available. It's in a format that's searchable. Moving into the 20th century, the archives. I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier. Our holdings for personal records tend to fall off after about the 1940s. You know, mostly for privacy issues. The state seals these records unless you have direct access to them by right of, you know, being related to the people in them. So we don't have as many here. They just haven't been sent here as of yet. But you know, the towns have better holdings, and so we can certainly help point you in the right place. You know, through some other research, if we can locate people and then send you to the right town to find vital records, birth, death, and marriage, or other types of records that the towns have that we haven't received. Farm names register, interesting collection, underutilized. There's not very many entries for it, but it does tell who owned a farm, description of the property, which often includes adjacent landowners. So they may or may not have been family members, and it covers up through 1949. Again, underutilized. I wish they had used that more. Hotel registers, one of the exceptions to after about the 1940s having no personal records. This is a census of people who were living in boarding houses in the 1960s and 1970s. And it's interesting because, of course, those censuses aren't going to be released for many years yet. I should have looked up, I don't remember how many books of those we have. But they're a useful way to place people from that time period, which is, again, unusual to have access to that from that time period. Jail blotters, some of the black sheep in the families, if you're interested in looking for those. This index is on our website. We've, I think, completed indexing of those up through the mid-1930s. And again, that index is on our website. It's by name, and it does tell where people were living at the time of their incarceration. Marriage records, an anomaly in our collection because marriage records, as I may have mentioned, are a local function. The licenses are issued by the towns and the cities, not the county. But during this time period, the county was receiving copies of marriage records. So it's one nice centrally located repository for marriage records here. Naturalization records with full information begin in 1906. So then you're going to find lots of family information, including where people, of course, where people came from in the old country and where they lived here in Westchester, and specific addresses as well, including where the children were born. New York State Census, of course, is online, but again, for those of you who like to look at everything, we have it on microfilm here. This is not indexed though, so it's a page-by-page kind of search thing. Voter enrollments. You do have to know where people were, which town they were in, but if you know which town they were in, this can provide a specific address. So here's a farm names register page from 1918 for property in Newcastle, and it's a nice full description which mentions adjacent landowners. This naturalization record is interesting, not just because the man was a stone carver who worked on Mount Rushmore, but also because, I don't know if you can see up here, it shows that he lived in Vermont for a while. He filed his first papers in Vermont, and the family didn't know that when they requested this record. They didn't know that he had ever lived in Vermont before he lived in New York. So not just useful for placing people in Westchester, but also telling you if they had been somewhere else previously. getting into the Historical Society for the 20th century. Many more different types of directories, again, by name, telling you where people were living, family histories, bibliographies of those, and the biographies, federal census up through 1930 on microfilm, many more maps, and newspapers all the way up through the 1990s. And this is a page from the Social Register, Social Record from 1930. Again, alphabetical by name, telling you where people were located. And remember these good old phone books. They have phone books from 1931 up through 2011, I believe. And this one is from 1948. So any questions up to this point? No, I threw a lot at you, but I want to pause and see if there's any questions for now.
Okay, class, this is your chance. Go ahead and unmute your microphone. Now, you mentioned in one of your earlier slides today about cemetery indexes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's funny that you bring this up this week, because last week in the class, we were talking about this very thing. And because of the fact, I think we were talking about Virginia at the time, but one of the class members had an ancestor who was in a very small cemetery. And now it might have been like just a family plot on the land they lived on at the time. You know, we're not really sure, but one of the things we talked about, because on Find a Grave, it just shows like 3 graves in that cemetery or so. One of the things we talked about last week was the value of those cemetery indexes that were taken back in time. Like, let's say during maybe the Civilian Conservation Corps might have done in the 1930s, a cemetery walkthrough. And because of the fact that sometimes those cemeteries may no longer exist,
Right.
or the stones that were in the cemeteries, if they still exist, may have fallen under, you know, they may have like broken and been removed, or they may have been buried by dirt over time. You know, so I kind of wanted to ask you, do you know the dates offhand of the walkthroughs that you have for those cemetery indexes? I mean, are they from the 1930s? Are they from the, 1880s? What time period are they from?
It's a pretty broad time period. I believe they were done throughout the 19th century. The most recent ones we have, they start to peter out around the 1930s. They don't seem to have any more that were done after that time period. And I sort of joke and say, oh, well, that's because, the radio was supplanting and keeping people, entertained at home, so they didn't have to go out and do research and dig around in the cemeteries for, I mean, it's a fascinating thing to do. And a lot of older cemeteries are being, people are getting grants, and organizations are getting grants and renovating them, which is really lovely, cleaning up the stones and getting the property in better order to pay tribute to the history. But yeah, the books of compilations, I believe, were started sometime. I don't know when the earliest ones were done. But one, of course, being that the one from the Dutch Reformed Church. I don't remember what the publication date on that is. But yeah, it stopped being a thing that organizations did sometime in the 1930s. So burials after that date are not as well recorded. But again, Patrick can help you with that if you're looking for something for someone that's buried after that time period.
And then that Dutch Reformed Church baptism record that you showed, that I was kind of fascinated by that. Now, there are some people in the class that are very, purist as far as their original source records are concerned. Do those original source records still exist to your knowledge?
I would have to check on that. I'd have to find out from Patrick who would have those, if they still exist. I don't know. I'm sorry. I did not think to check into that.
Okay. And then you mentioned local census. Now, we all know about state census. We all know about federal census, but can you tell us a little bit more about local census?
Yeah, they were usually done by the towns. I don't know whether they would have just been landowners early on, or whether they would have listed, because I haven't looked at one of them in a while, or whether they would have listed all residents. But they're usually compiled in books, or they were published in town minutes. I could look into more on that. I don't know that much about them off the top of my head.
Okay.
I'm just excited to see that some of them went back to the 1680s.
Jolene, I see that you have your microphone on. Is there a question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I would like to, I missed the name of the person to contact for cemetery information.
Oh, that's Patrick Raftery. His name is in one of the handouts
Okay,
that I provided. Yeah, he's the librarian from the Westchester County Historical Society.
got it.
His email's in there.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then I wanted to ask you, you said that there were certain gaps in certain areas. Was that due to like a courthouse burning?
The White Plains Courthouse was burned during the Revolutionary War. I don't know specifically what happened to those records. I have heard of records being taken from courthouses and town centers and being placed on ships for safekeeping or in people's homes. And then, of course, some of them didn't come back. So that's really the extent of my knowledge about that. And of course, some of them just were not stored well. Some of the ones we have show significant deterioration from water damage or, I don't know, being nibbled on by mice or, just interesting colors on some of them or the ink running. But we're doing our best to preserve them. And of course, keeping them in a temperature and humidity controlled vault helps. But no, I don't know specifically on certain records why we don't have them. When the archives was created, different departments were asked to just send over whatever they had that was dated before 1911 because of state law was passed after there was a fire in the New York State Library in 1911, mandating that all the counties keep copies of all historic records dating before that time period, because if there were copies at the New York State Library, they had most likely been destroyed. And so the county copies were the only ones that still existed. And so Westchester, when the archives was established in 1985, they started, beating the bushes, and every department that had records that dated from before was asked to send them over, so most notably the county clerk's office and the courts. So whatever they could find, whatever still existed, was sent over here. And in a lot of cases, they just didn't know why they didn't have what they didn't have. So, and nobody had made a note of why they didn't have it. So I don't know, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Give it just a few seconds.
Sure.
One of the students says that she's having troubles with her microphone, so I'm just going to give it a few more moments to see if she can fix that, if she has a question. If not, she
put
can.
Something in the chat.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have access to that, but if you can monitor that, maybe.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I'm keeping an eye on it.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, you can go ahead and proceed, Jackie. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So I'm going to now go to, oops, I forgot to take my email down. Sorry about that. So I will go into the demonstrations now. I think I provided these websites. I'm pretty sure I did, just so that you know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to show you how to use the deeds index. Again, it's a function of the county clerk's office because the deeds were originally registered with that office. And I'm going to show you right from the county clerk's website, which is www.westchesterclerk.com. Scroll past all of this and all these resource buttons.
Oh, hold on, Jackie, we're not seeing that. We're still seeing your question slide.
All right, so here's the county clerk's website. So we're scrolling down past all these resource buttons and we're going to records online. Sorry, I forgot about that part. We talked about that Wednesday, but I did make note of it and then I forgot. So This is a subscription service that the county clerk's office provides. You have to pay to see the deeds, but you have access to the index for free. So the deeds are under land records. If you click on this, it's going to bring you up to the index is in two parts. This part that it defaults to is the modern part. It's 1967 to the present. What you want to do if you're doing historic research is go to this third tab called Index Books. This is the older part of the index. As you see here, year range, it covers, it's actually not 1680, it's 1684. That's the oldest part, and then it goes up through increments to 1966. For the oldest part of the index, again, useful for placing people because you don't need to know where people were living or where the property was located to find a deed. You just need a name. So what you do is, if you're looking in the oldest part of the index, you just leave it on default like this and select whether you're searching for buyer or seller, grantee or grantor, and then you just put in the last name. Last name is all you really need. It's probably not going to read more than the first like 5 letters of what you're putting in anyway. So I'm going to search for Hadley, and then you click search over here, this little blue search. And sometimes it's really slow and sometimes it's really fast. So fingers crossed, let's hope it's not too slow. There we go. Okay, so what's happening, I don't know, can you see my cursor?
Yeah, we can see the cursor.
Okay, so all of this is just a repetition of what you entered over here on the left. This is not showing that you're getting all these returns. What you're interested in over here is you can see there's a range of names because what they did was they digitized the index books and put them in this software that OCRs and searches through the names for the first letter of the name and then the first vowel. It's an interesting system. It works. So what you need to do is find out where Hadley falls, and in this case it happens to fall within this first file here, and you click on the little box under image. And here's your index page. I'm gonna enlarge it so it's a little easier to read. And then we're
still seeing the one that says file name Haig through Hagman.
Oh dear. So I wonder if I'm going to have to stop sharing. Do I have to do that again?
You should be able to just share your whole screen. Let's see here, but it looks like actually I can see your tabs: Westchester County Archives, Westchester County Archives, online collections. I can see that, but for some reason we're not seeing the next screen that you are at right now.
Okay.
You can share an app, you can share a window, or you can share your entire screen, but you got to pick from those different share options when you initially do the share.
Let's try you share.
Oh, now we're seeing it. Grantee from grantor.
So somehow I didn't see a selection of sharing everything. So I've just been clicking on the various different things. So I apologize that it's a little clunky this way, but bear with me. So we're going to go down to, you can see in a couple of cases too, they very helpfully suggested different spellings of last names because of course, especially early on, name spellings were not set hard and fast. And so they sometimes represent a lot of alternate spellings of names. And they made note of that in the index, which I find helpful. All right, still going down. Here's Hadley. So there's 2 spellings of Hadley. Specifically, I'm looking at Joseph because he was an early resident of Westchester. So what we're looking at here on the left is I asked for it to search by grantee, which was buyer. So here's our buyer, Joseph Hadley. Here's who he purchased the property from, who is John Bett, I believe. It'll show when I show you what the record looks like. So the first column is the buyer, since I asked to search buyer. The second column is the seller, because they're going to list both. The next 3 columns are the date that it was recorded with the county clerk's office, not necessarily the date that the sale of the property took place. This is the date that they took it to the clerk's office and actually had the record recorded. And the last two columns are important because they tell you which book number or letter that the deed was recorded in, and then the page number. This, because of the schmutz in the background, is a little hard to read, but you can enlarge it, as you're searching, and it'll be more legible. I'm not going to keep fiddling with it. But when you are searching this, because it's a subscription, it's a $20 fee to actually look at records. My suggestion for a strategy is look up all the people you want to look up in the index for free, see how much there is to look at. You can either print or download the pages from the index, or make note of the records you want to see, however you want to make note of them. And then what you would want to do then is go out back to, let's go back out. Oops, what did I do? Going back out to this. We're going to, I have to move this, go back out to the home screen and click here to register. You'll enter some information, including a user ID and a password. I'm not going to continue because I'm not going to put information, so it's not going to let me continue. But you can pay the $20, using a credit card right online. It'll give you 24 hours of access, and you can print and download anything that you want during that time period, as much as you want. There's no limit. So we are going to look at that deed. So to look at the deeds, you go to this middle tab here, search by number, and remember that the index has two parts. So the records are divided the same way. The earlier part of the index from the 1680s up to 1966 is listed down here. Again, it defaults to the more recent. So you have to tell it that you're looking at the records before 1967, because if you put in the librarian page number down here and you forget to change this from post 67 to pre 67, it's not going to show you anything. So you have to remember to change that. But you just put in the library. If it's a number, you put in the number. If it's a letter, you just type in the letter. You click search. It's going to do the same thing that it did before. It repeats the information that you gave it, and then you click on the little box for image. And I'm guessing you probably can't see the new window that popped up, right, with the image of the deed.
No, we're just seeing the
Okay.
the database.
Okay, so I will go back and new share and show you this.
Now we see it.
Yep, and here's our deed. Now this is a transcription. Another WPA project that was done in the 1930s was they went through a lot of the old deed books and had them transcribed. And they transcribed them page by page exactly as the information appeared in the book, including all the quirky spellings and the odd spacings, and they're really kind of charming that way, I think. But here's the date, 1687, that we saw of the deed being registered, and then where the property was located, Yonkers, or as they call it here, Yonkers. And notice, because it was still a British colony, this is James II is named here, the King of England. So just a little bit of history contained there. All right, I'm going to minimize this and go back to the deeds index. So does anybody have any questions about that? Anything else you want me to go over with that? Anything I did too quickly? Something you're not clear on?
Class, you can go ahead and turn on your mic. No? Okay, well, go ahead and proceed, Jackie. Thank you.
So we will go on to, just going to log out and close this. And we'll go on to our website. Is everybody seeing Westchester County Archives website?
Yes, we can see it.
Very good. Okay, so everything is listed here. You want this menu tab up here in the right-hand corner. And when it brings up this menu, I'm going to show you how to access the guide to collections. There's a couple of different ways you can search collections. You start by clicking on collections. We have digital collections that brings you to, well, I might as well just show you various atlases. This is one way to get to it. There's also, I'll show you the page itself, which I gave you the address for. So there's various different atlases. There's photos, some photo collections. We've got annual messages. You know, a lot of this is not so useful for genealogy. It's more image-based. But just so you know that that's what digital collections covers. Going back again to collections. Then if you want to look at what we have, full range of everything, you can do records by department, records by subject, records by year. I like to do, especially if I'm doing genealogical research, to refresh my memory sometimes what's available for different chronological periods. As you can see, you know, this is sort of the basis I used for my presentation, going century by century. Here's the bastardy proceedings. We can look at that. Here's the listing for them, describing what they are, what years they cover. We can also look at, there's a lot listed under the county clerk's office if you want to look at, coroner's inquest records. These are a little bit tricky, actually. I didn't mention them because we have, as you can see, kind of spotty holdings. They're kind of a disappointment. We don't have a lot of them. The ones we have are in very poor condition. A lot of them have been digitized, but they're not on our website. Every now and then I'll find something someone's looking for, but I wish they were in better shape and we had more of them, because they're just really, they could be potentially very fascinating records. But as you can see, there's records from a lot of different county departments as well. Not all useful for genealogy though, just a lot of just general history information. So next we're going to go to the indexes. Click on that twice and it brings up the index page. And here's where we've got our genealogy stuff that's good for genealogy. Starting, for example, with the court records, you click on that entry, click on search index. You can search by last name, first name, year. So searching for someone, the last name Heath, brings up all the listings, first name, or if it only mentions initials, the year of the record, the type of record it is, which court it was done in. Sometimes it tells you, as I mentioned, the town, and then this is my information, how I would find the record. Let's try search again. Let's see. Someone mentioned Purdy. Let's pull up the Purdys. There's going to be a lot of Purdys. And some of these tell the town where the person was living. For example, is Andrew Purdy. Other times there was a courthouse in Bedford and there was a courthouse in White Plains. So instead it mentions the courthouse where the court action took place. And sometimes the record itself will tell where the people were. Sometimes it doesn't. So let's go back to the indexes. Also wanted to show you, let's see, veteran cemetery cards. Now this is taking us to the digital site. This is one way to get there. This is what I was talking about with these veteran cemetery index cards. This is one that's fairly well filled out. This is exactly what they look like. This is the actual record that was created. It was a large index card, and as you can see, this one contains a lot of information about the person: next of kin, date of discharge, branch of service, war record, date of death, date of burial, buried in the rural cemetery in White Plains. He served in the Civil War, and he was born in North Carolina. Somehow ended up in White Plains. If you want to see other records, you can click on Browse and bring up an alphabetical listing. Again, it tells you where they were buried, where they're buried, and what war they served in, just right in the original entry. If you want to search by name, pick on the Heaths again, and bring up one record for Charles Heath. There's the image again. You can enlarge it. He's buried in St. Paul's in Eastchester in the city of Mount Vernon, which is actually a historic church. And then there's some information about the record itself, which if you wanted a copy of it, I probably don't need that information actually from this one. Oh, but here's another, let's see, do we have that? If you click on the cemetery, it'll show you all the people buried in that same cemetery. So you can have some fun with this, exploring this.
I noticed it says American Revolution soldiers. Since we have some people here logged in today that are members of the DAR, do all of them, if they're an American Revolution soldier, are they so noted on the index right there?
This I really don't know what this entry refers to. I have to confess.
It just has a name of a soldier. It was probably an unknown name.
Yeah, it looks like they're, oh, it says down at the bottom, here are interred the skeletons of American Revolutionary soldiers found in Tuckahoe in 1909. Yeah. So I guess they reinterred them over in St. Paul's instead. That's really interesting. I had not come across this record before. But in other cases, if we click on the name of the war, you can see that's a link to. This will bring up all the veterans from the Revolutionary War.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful.
Listed in this, yeah. So that's another way to explore it. Is there's a lot of great this software is very flexible for that. You can there's lots of ways to link and search, and you can see these people are buried all over the place in Sleepy Hollow, in Yonkers, Old Dutch Burying Ground, also in Sleepy Hollow. There's two different cemeteries in the same area in Sleepy Hollow. So that is definitely worth exploring that way. So any other questions about the indexes? And
yeah, I see right over there on the filter on the right hand, excuse me, on the left hand side, where it says war served, American Revolutionary War, French and Indian War, and War of 1812. Oh yes. My gosh, that's a real nice help.
Yes, yeah, this software, well, that's why it was chosen, is because it has a lot of flexibility and it gives you a lot of prompts. So yeah, it's a great tool because of that. And I think I mentioned that this was a WPA project, so it only covers, I think I forgot to mention that it covers pre-revolution, but it does cover only up through World War I because it was compiled in the 1930s, so it doesn't cover World War II.
Well, that can really help a lot of people with their applications to get into like the Daughters of 1812 or the daughter or the Sons of the American Revolution or the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Yes, but this is it. This card, this is the entire record. There is no background like file that they put together after this. Whatever information they found, they didn't keep copies of the records that they found, which would have been really helpful. They put it all on this card, and the card is all we have. It's a lot in some cases, and of course there's other sources that can be searched for information about these people, such as the MacDonald Papers or other sources in the Historical Society's collection. Or of course you can take these names and search through our indexes and see what other records we have on them. Any questions about these?
I'm so thankful that this was done back in that time period, because honestly, so many cemeteries have been relocated, and a lot of times when the cemeteries are relocated, like for instance, the example you just showed a few moments ago, the bodies may not be interred individually again. They're put all in one spot, you know, one burial spot rather than individual burial spots. For instance, here locally, we have a cemetery in Carson City, and they had, I believe it was Civil War deceased that were buried originally in Fort Churchill, which is about an hour or so from here. And then they reinterred them in Carson City. But when they reinterred them, they didn't necessarily have the names that came with the remains. And so they just put them into one spot, and, you know, they're kind of memorialized. So I can see the real value of these, because if that person's marker or that person's grave no longer exists for whatever the reason is, this is a snapshot in time that, yes, they were there at one period.
Yes, that's true, because some of the cemeteries have deteriorated too. I mentioned that there are groups getting grants for renovating the cemeteries, but some of them are still in disrepair and the headstones are no longer legible. So this, at least, right, as you were saying, is an indication of where the burials are, even if the headstones are no longer legible, or the cemetery's been overgrown or something. At least it's still possible to locate the grave. I wanted to show, actually reminded me, I'm going to go back to, I think it's under digital collections, and show you, where are these? Cemetery maps that are connected with these records, and they will show you, let's find this one. Bedford has really kept up their cemeteries. Usually they have a number. I guess it's just maybe section by section in this cemetery, showing you. Well, this one doesn't seem to have any numbers. I picked up the wrong one. Oops. Let's go back and see. Oops. Oh dear, what did I do? St. Paul's Church. All right, if you zoom in, you're going to see these numbers will correspond. These are not linkable, but if you look at the cards, they're going to have a number on them, and that's the number of the grave site. So if you find the corresponding map, you can locate the location of the grave from doing that. If you click on this, it brings up the corresponding card. And it shows which war, you know, again.
So, oh my gosh, that's great.
Yeah, so play around with this if you're interested in the burial sites. Again, it's not a comprehensive list. There may be people that you know of who are not, unfortunately, in this list, but as you see, there's a good number of records in here, and hopefully you will find what you're looking for in here. But yeah, it has a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of cross-referencing. Any other questions about using the indexes? I wanted to talk a little bit more about the digital site and show some of the maps and atlases that are on there. If we're ready to move on. If not, talk about this some more.
Okay, we'll just give the class a minute, just a few moments.
I missed your original, I had speaker problems. I had to leave the meeting and come back in.
Oh, sorry.
And I have family in this neighborhood, so I'm really interested. Can you show me the original path to finding these indexes?
Sure. So if you go back to our website,
because I went on your website yesterday to search and I didn't quite get there. So
Okay, well, getting where exactly?
to the indexes that you were just at.
Okay, so you're going up to menu up here on the
Okay.
top right, and then you go down here to indexes.
Got it.
Okay, click on that twice. It'll bring up a list, but it's not a full list. And then you scroll down and there's the personal name indexes, other indexes, online photograph and map collection.
I'm good. Thank you, Jackie.
You're
I
welcome.
didn't go that way.
That's why I'm here.
We appreciate that.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Thank you.
get me talking all day about this.
Perfect. I'm
Thanks
happy
for
to
the
have
question. Anything else? No, thanks. That's doesn't hurt to review.
Okay, any other questions? And Jean, I'll ask you to turn off your camera. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, Jackie, continue. Okay, Jackie, go ahead.
All right. So going on to the digital site through the main page here. If you scroll down, there's a couple, first of all, highlighted. You notice this is the same photo. This is actually a photo that's up in our reading room. For any of you who are familiar with Yonkers or have family in Yonkers, this is a shot of the downtown section in Getty Square around 1925. And we just all absolutely love this photo just because there's so much going on in it. So I just have to call that out. There's a number of atlases. Here's our cemetery records again. Several photo collections. The Bronx River Parkway map collection. Bronx River Parkway was the first public parkway completed in the country, and the model for many other parkway systems throughout the country. It was built in the 1920s, completed in 1925. 1881 atlas, 1901 atlas, 1910 atlas. Let's play around with 1901. So you can browse, again, bring up all the pages starting from the index page. This will bring up the entire county and show you it's sideways. So let's see, can we rotate it? There we go, there's Westchester, as I'm used to seeing it, but of course everything's labeled sideways. Any particular area anybody wants to look at? Or archivist's choice? Here's the Hudson River, here's Long Island Sound. All right, I'm gonna pick, let's see, going back. Look at Cortland.
Could you,
Sure.
could you find Phillipsburg?
Phillipsburg. Any particular section of Phillipsburg? Because Phillipsburg Manor did not exist anymore by 1901.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Just, I thought general area of where it was.
Oh,
but-
okay. Well, let me go back to this and I will show you what Phillipsburg was. That's actually a really good question because I showed you an earlier iteration of it. So Phillipsburg would have been all of this, as I'm outlining, from the Hudson River all the way up to this funny little point near the western boundary of Newcastle down here. So it contained Ossining, Mount Pleasant, Greenburgh, and Yonkers. And also, you know, territory down here because it existed before the Bronx was broken off from Westchester. So it extended all the way down through southern Yonkers, West Farms, Morrisania, and into the area, I don't know if anybody has heard that really funny name, Spuyten Duyvil, that area that's just north of New York, the very tip of New York City, where the East River breaks off, the Harlem River breaks off from the Hudson. So that was all Phillipsburg, all of this territory.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. So we will go to Portland. I have a prejudice for Cortland because that's the area where I live. Actually, I'm going to show you Peekskill. Peekskill is an interesting area because up until 1940, it's a city now, but it wasn't a city. It was a village and then a town that was part of the town of Cortland. And so if you're looking for records from Peekskill, you are actually not going to find them in the city of Peekskill before the date of 1940 because it was part of the town of Cortland. And so the records would be with the town of Cortland instead of with the city of Peekskill. So if you're looking for birth, death, and marriage records, for example, before 1940, you're not going to find them with the city of Peekskill. They're going to tell you that they don't have them. They won't tell you why. They'll tell you that they don't have them. And they don't have them because, as I mentioned, Peekskill is part of the town of Cortland, and the records are with the town of Cortland. That's one of the really fun quirks about Westchester. So here's downtown Peekskill in 1901. It's quite an industrial center. You can see the riverfront was all built up, docks and coal yards and ironworks. And here's the convent, which actually still exists. It doesn't own all that land anymore, but they ran an orphanage, actually, the Sisters of St. Francis, and they still have very good records, by the way, and they keep their own records. If you're looking for children who would have been in an orphanage in Peekskill from that time period. And the city really hasn't changed. The layout is pretty much the same as it was in 1901. So, and you see they, you know, except for the small individual lots, larger lots shows property ownership. There was a military academy. Chauncey Depew was a significant resident. He was, I believe, in US Congress for a while. So there's Peekskill. Anything else anyone wants to look at? Any questions you have about the digital sites?
Just give it a few moments.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Jackie.
I hope that was valuable. All right, I am going to go back to, where is my, so those were the sites that we just looked at. Any questions on that?
No, it doesn't sound like it.
Okay, so I said I always like to talk a little bit about the importance of documenting. If you're at a repository, make sure you write the source on all photocopies. If you have the ability to copy or have photographed title pages, file or box numbers, please do that so you remember where things came from. When you post online, please, please, please include the source so somebody else can find out where you got something from. Because I very often get people saying, oh, I found this document online, you know, is it something from your collection because it's something from Westchester? And sometimes it is, and we can find it, sometimes it isn't, and then I have no idea where it came from. So, so please include the source for the benefit of other researchers. And it's helpful, new people, to keep a log. If there's any new genealogists, keep a log of where you've been and what you did there, who you spoke with, and their contact information. I like to give a shout out to all the people I have learned many, many things from, who have helped me over the years. And then here, this information is in one of the handouts. Here's contact information. Patrick Raftery, that's how he spells his last name. It's not Rafferty, it's Raftery. So you don't have to write that down because that is in a handout. And if you're in the area, please make an appointment for the reading room. We're still in COVID time, Wednesdays by appointment. There's actually, I should have shown you that. On our website, the main page, there is a link to the software where you would make appointments. But if you have questions about that, you can certainly contact me as well. And that concludes. I want to thank you all so much for your time, attention, interest. Great questions. Thank you.
Jackie, I have a question. Since some of the people in my class do genealogy field trips where they actually go to other states and do their research, assuming that they can make an appointment with no problem through your website, what would you suggest that they bring with them?
Specifically, I would say if they have certain questions that they know that they want answered, if it's possible to bring photos, background information that they have, notes, that help support, because I very often will have people come in and start to do research on something and realize that they have not remembered to bring one key source that they had some question about, or something that helped support what they were looking at, and they can't remember what that thing was that was in that piece of paper. So make sure that whatever questions you specifically want answered, or put it in an email, shoot it to me ahead of time, give me some background, let me know where you got the information that you're researching, that you started from, a little context for your question. If you have something from us that you've already gotten, mention that you've already gotten something from us and you want to do further research on it. Or if you have something from another source that you're following up on, let me know what that is. If you can send me a copy of it somehow, that's helpful too. I often will get questions about court records. People saw a notice in the newspaper and don't think to send me the newspaper notice, which would answer several questions and make it very simple for me to find the court record. If they can dig it up again and send it to me, it makes it very simple. If they can't, sometimes I have to spend a while figuring out which court it took place in, what time period it was, did it actually happen in Westchester, for example? And I don't mind doing that because I'm a researcher. I love digging around in things, but very often, whatever source you raised your question, if you can provide that, that is usually very helpful. So again, a list of questions, knowing what you want to research, giving me some context, and any key pieces of information that you have that will help explain or further your search are helpful.
Do they need to bring like a flash drive with them? Do they need to bring quarters with them for copying? What supplies would they need to bring with them?
Oh, yes, that's a good question. We permit you to bring in your phone to use as a camera. If you prefer, you have a separate camera, you want to bring that in, that's fine. Tablets are allowed, laptops are allowed. We do not allow, the IT department absolutely forbids us to put outside flash drives in our computers. But what we can do is we can either scan documents for you and email the pages to you, or you're welcome to take pictures of anything that you want to take pictures of for your own purposes. We do not allow scanners that have lids. If you have one of those handheld wand type scanners, you want to bring that. Those are permitted because they don't affect the paper in any way. It just hovers over the paper. You're allowed to bring in notes. If you have a lot of notes, I might ask you to leave some of them outside for a while just to keep things organized. Trying to think what else. We provide scrap paper, we provide pencils, no eating and drinking in the reading room. Did I answer all your questions? I feel like there's something I forgot.
No, that's exactly what I was wondering,
Okay.
because like I said, some of the students actually do go cross country
Yeah,
specifically for research purposes. And, because you're on the road, you can't always know what to bring in advance with you. So it's very helpful to know that. So.
yeah. So you don't have to bring quarters. If you want photocopies, we make them. It's 50 cents a page. We are unfortunately not set up for payment by credit card though. So do bring cash or checks if you're going to have a significant number of copies made. But again, we encourage most people now to take their own photos if they can. And, phone cameras now usually take excellent pictures, or you can bring a tablet, which takes good pictures too.
Perfect.
Oh, and We are located outside of White Plains, so you don't have to worry about parking. We have our own parking lot. It's free. There's a bus also that comes out from White Plains if you're coming up from New York City by train. The bus stops right in front of our building here. And there's not a lot in the way of food. Although if you have a car, you know, there's places we can direct you to if you're going to be here, you know, into lunchtime and you want to eat before you go on to somewhere else. Or if you want to bring a snack, we do have a kitchen where you can set up and eat something there. Although during COVID, we have kind of been discouraging that, but you know, it depends. You know, if you have a question, there's an issue, you know, talk to me, tell me what's going on, and we'll work something out.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, I'll let the class have one more opportunity to ask questions. We'll just wait just a few more moments.
Sure.
Okay, well, I guess there's no more questions, Jackie, but that was a wonderful presentation, and we certainly appreciate, you know, your help with assisting our research for the second time, once again, last time as well as this time. Very generous with your time, and that is so appreciated. And the fact that you were able to do 2 different presentations, I know that a lot of work goes into those, so we really appreciate it.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. I can talk about this, as I said, all day. I often do. And as I was preparing this, I realized that I actually had enough information when I started out for 3 presentations. I had to winnow it down quite a bit and focus it. So I might be ready next year for something else if you want to do that. And I should be developing them for presentation other places too. So
I will reach out to you again. Okay, and before I stop the recording, I just want to tell the class that the class will go on for another hour and a half. So if you'd like to stay, I hope you do. And if you decide you'd like to leave at this point, all you have to do is click on that red end button and it'll take you out of today's session. But before you do, if there's anything in the chat box that you want to download, please do that before you log off, because once you log off, even if you log back in, you will lose the chat box. So with that, I'll go ahead once again, Jackie, and say thank you. And I will go ahead and stop the recording.